Thanks so much for joining us today for the first Demonova Talk. So today I want to talk to you about some research that I published last year on mobilizing during the COVID-19 pandemic. And mobilizing during the pandemic is very fascinating because it really defied our expectations in so many ways. And it really forced us to reconsider, as social movement scholars in particular, some of the longstanding concepts and cherished notions that we had been holding on to for many years. The paper that I'm drawing on today was published in American Behavioral Scientist. It's quite an ambitious and wide-ranging paper, but today I'll just be focusing on some of the elements in that paper. So when the pandemic hit, it really caused us to change our expectations for what human behavior would be in the face of the specific challenges and risks that were posed by this crisis. So, no está pasando el, oh, here we go, sorry, it is, I click on that, so, sorry. So what did we expect to happen with mobilization during the pandemic? Well, the first unsurprising thesis or hypothesis was that people would start going online, right? That social movements would take advantage of the digital tools and the internet to go online. And given the risk of contagion and the consequences of contagion, especially in the beginning of the pandemic when we did not have a vaccine, the risk was really high. So, and also, there were restrictions in place on social distancing, and there were lockdown requirements. So it was a logical expectation to think that people would be going online. And the second expectation that I had was that as the death toll began to rise, and as people became aware of really stark differences between how different governments were managing and containing that pandemic, that we would find protests to demand that governments do more to protect citizens from the virus. And neither of these expectations was upheld. Although protest activity did fall across the world, we nevertheless witnessed widespread mass street protests. And notable examples include the global Black Lives Matter, following George Floyd's murder by the US police, Poland's protests against abortion restrictions, Thailand's student demands for political reform, Lebanon was in flames demanding an end to corruption, and widespread anti-lockdown protests in the US and Germany and many other countries. So with very few exceptions, the only case that I'm familiar with is the case of Israel. None of these mass protests was socially distanced. So people were assuming a risk, a very high risk, to continue to protest in the streets. And in the second place, in the face of high mortality rates and these significant disparities in those effectiveness of national public health responses, we didn't witness widespread mobilizations demanding that governments do more to protect the citizens. Instead, what we saw were two really radically different responses from social movements. At one extreme, we've seen veterans of pro-democracy movements transferring their skills to either substitute for weak government responses to COVID, such as in the case of Hong Kong, or to directly contribute to government efforts to contain the virus, as we saw in Taiwan. And at the other end of the pole, we see anti-democratic and predominantly far right wing, but not only far right wing, mobilizations demanding the easing of restrictions, and they've circulated COVID-19 conspiracy theories. So the weaponization, the political weaponization of disinformation has in fact been one of the most striking features of mobilization during the pandemic. So let's take a closer look at some of these responses. And I'll begin by discussing briefly the positive responses. So in Taiwan, activists worked directly with the government to alert people to the virus before the WHO even was aware and had confirmed its existence. So they were the first to already start working with the government on that. They used open source civic innovation platforms and strategies to combat disinformation, to make effective allocations of resources in the country, and to make sure that citizens were aware of the latest WHO information and so on. And so in that case, they worked directly with the government to really effectively contain the negative impact of the pandemic. So Taiwan had the fewest deaths, I think, of anywhere. They had maybe 9 deaths at a time when other countries were having hundreds of thousands. And it was this early response by these activists that played a huge role in this, and all their collaboration afterwards. Now, in Hong Kong, there was a very different scenario, because there, the government really failed to effectively respond to the threat, even when the threat was evident. And it was the activists who called attention to the problem, who began to self-mobilize and self-organize to address the problem directly. So they were getting hand sanitizer and masks out to people. They were making sure people were informed. They were defying the ban on wearing masks. And so the details of these cases are really quite fascinating. But the larger point that I want to make is that these examples really provide evidence for the longer term impacts of social movement innovation on democracy beyond the initial periods of mobilization. So they're examples of how the afterlives of social movements, so the tools, the knowledge, the networks, and the resources that are developed in them, can lead to democratic innovation that's designed to correct democratic deficits in the face of new challenges, such as the pandemic. Okay. Now, what's interesting is that in each case, the activists in these pro-democracy movements in both places played a key role in improving the response to the pandemic. And of course, it's clear that their savvy use of digital technology and media played a key role in this, from crowdsourcing information, tracking stock levels of masks in pharmacies, or at a much more sophisticated level, working to combat disinformation. And I think it's very interesting that so little attention has been paid to these cases, given how much they were modeling best practices in innovation at a time when the whole world was trying to solve the same problem. And that in itself, I think, says something about the limitations of transnational diffusion of best practices, which is a real problem when addressing global challenges. But as far as these cases go, so far, so good, right? This is the positive side of the story. And of course, we also had solidarity networks emerging out of many social movement communities that were also pivoting to address the vulnerable people in the pandemic. But in other places, things began to go very wrong. And thanks to the power of social media and disinformation and misinformation, COVID negationism and disinformation spread all across the world. And much more attention, perhaps understandably, has been paid to these more negative mobilization responses. Perhaps because for people who believe in science and think we're living in the modern world, they seem so bizarre and unexpected. So what actually happened? Well, let's start in the USA, since this is where a lot of the conspiracy theories that traveled across the world have their origin. Soon after the global outbreak of COVID-19, far-right protests against stay-at-home orders and mask wearing really swept across the United States. And these were organized or attended by a mixture of right-wing anti-government militias, white supremacists, conspiracy theorists, neo-fascists such as the Proud Boys. And these far-right extremists kickstarted what would become a transnational ripple of protests against the so-called plandemic, demanding an end to lockdown restrictions and mask-wearing measures, spreading conspiracy theories that either denied the virus's existence or attributed it to, take your pick, a global Jewish cabal, Bill Gates, 5G, or the deep state. Protesters in these mobilizations were sometimes armed. They engaged in activities such as verbally abusing healthcare workers, blocking ambulances, and other such measures. in terms of political weaponization, most of these protests had a clear pro-Trump, far right-wing agenda, with Proud Boy hate groups mobilizing, quote, against the Democrat-driven unconstitutional lockdown, close quote. So here we see a really clearly how these anti-COVID protests were politically weaponized in a partisan way and with an electoral agenda because of the context at the time. So these protests were fueled by social media communities that were really rife with conspiracy theories and disinformation about the virus, such as QAnon groups. And in the run-up to the 2020 presidential election, Trump supporters and anti-mask conspiracy theorists believed or argued that the data on COVID-19 deaths had been exaggerated and manipulated to hurt Trump politically. And Trump, of course, participated in actively spreading that idea by bizarrely encouraging people to defy the public health measures of his own administration, which is quite a bizarre scenario, right? And declaring support for these protesters who were against his own administration's health expert advice. But the interesting part of this story for me, particularly interesting, is that what started out as a mix of extreme right-wing pandemic conspiracy theories that were very much made in the USA and tied up with this pro-Trump political agenda, which you can sort of understand, spread to Canada and countries in Europe after the US protests had waned. And so not only did the anti-mask, anti-lockdown, and COVID negationist elements transfer over, but bizarrely, so did support for Donald Trump, who obviously could have no influence on national politics outside the United States directly, right? So that shows a continuity between QAnon and Breitbart from one sphere of mobilization to the other. And research has shown how these conspiracy theories and the photos of the US protests on Telegram and other social media sites were widely spread in European contexts. But these weren't imported wholesale, right? It's not just that you take the US stuff and then you disseminate it in another context. They were modified and adapted to local political agendas. And they were adapted to align with particular local and national agendas and political cultures. And what this tells us is two main things. On the one hand, it shows us how elastic and how flexible COVID-19 resistance narratives can be across different contexts. But it also highlights how social movements always adapt influences from other contexts to their own national agendas when there's transnational diffusion. Now, in Spain, for example, the far right-wing party Vox played a key role in fostering COVID-19 resistance and related anti-government protests. The party consistently voted against government proposals to address the pandemic. They called for protests in front of Parliament to reject them. They directed their office holders to support the protests against the government's policies, and so on. They also called for a Caravan of Freedom protest in May 2020, and that's the picture that you can see there, where they demanded the resignation of the government, and they had about 6,000 cars and motorcycles that caused a terrible traffic jam in Madrid, and they also had this in other cities in Spain. And protesters at this protest talked about being forced to buy masks, but at the same time argued that the government should resign because they had failed to handle the pandemic. So the messaging was quite confused and quite confusing. And over time, if we compare the earlier mobilizations along these lines to the later ones, what we see is much more explicit conspiracy theory language coming into the picture, and their demands are shifting as well. And by the summer of August 2020, many of the protesters who initially were wearing masks stopped wearing masks, and they began calling for freedom and began chanting slogans that both affirmed and denied the existence of the virus. So it's kind of like, which is it? Or you were against the virus that exists or not, So these are just some of the chants translated into English from that particular protest in Madrid, just to give you a taste of the kind of crazy mix of conspiracy and demands and who it's oriented to. And you can see the Bill Gates is in here and 5G is in here. So New World Order and false positives, so doubting science and so on. So the thing in Spain that we see is a very clear weaponization by the far right, in a partisan way, tied to an actual political party agenda, and a very confused mix of messages, and a clear influence of US conspiracy theories in that context. Now, in Germany, the panorama was very different in that the anti-lockdown protests there were much more widespread, and they attracted a much more heterogeneous and diverse population of protesters and a support base. And even though the presence of the far right is also prominent there, and QAnon is really thriving in Germany. So in Germany, Querdenken, or lateral thinkers, organized 2 large rallies of about 10,000 people in Berlin, about 20,000 in Leipzig, to protest measures to contain the pandemic. And videos of the protests show that most of them were not wearing masks. These were held in November 2020, and they were not socially distancing. Researchers have concluded that these 2 German anti-lockdown protests led to as many as 21,000 infections. And one of the leaders was hospitalized, and another one, I'm not sure if it's the same one or another one, actually died. So one of the leaders of this died of COVID. So irony doesn't even really begin to cover the outcome of this bizarre mobilization. And research has shown that support for these protests in Germany really are driven mostly by conspiracy theorists and far right-wing extremists. But we have to remember that the drivers and the recipients are not the same people. So it's really interesting to note the ideological heterogeneity of the protesters in Germany, which encompassed everything from climate and peace activists to evangelical Trump supporters who wanted to make America great again, to neo-Nazis. And one young woman gave a speech comparing herself to Nazi resistor Sophie Scholl, the student who was executed in 1943, which is a claim that was particularly bizarre given her willingness to march right alongside neo-Nazis. So it's a bit of a crazy panorama there. So here are just some more slides from different protests. This is in the UK. And here is another one from Spain where they're saying, it's a part of Madrid. It just says it's a safe place to be in the fresh air, so we shouldn't need to wear masks, but you'll notice they are wearing masks. So that's also an interesting contradiction. So what's clear is that these COVID-19 resistance narratives are very elastic. They can be mobilized across a range of contexts. But protesters do share some common characteristics. Transnationally, they tend to have extreme political orientations, mostly right-wing, but also left-wing. They tend to have strong rejections of scientific and expert knowledge about the virus and the pandemic. And they tend to have a proclivity for conspiracy theories, as it makes sense. And although we can still say that they represent maybe a fringe or a minority view, they have still attracted significant numbers. And the extent to which they influence public opinion and the impact that their distortion of the information landscape has on public's decision to ignore or actively counteract government-led public health messaging and expert scientific advice is still an important question. So in November 2020, for example, German polls showed that 85% of people opposed Querdenken beliefs in Germany. But in the context of a lethal pandemic where compliance is absolutely crucial, it's imperative, really, that still leaves us with an alarming number of people. I mean, in the German case, about 12.4 million people who were subscribing to these beliefs. And at the time that the research was conducted, popularity for this view was growing on social media. So given the transnational nature of the spread, then obviously our attention needs to go to the role of social media in spreading this. And I'll just briefly turn to that now. So one factor that we need to consider is the fact that lockdown measures gave people a lot more time to spend online, especially if they were isolated from other family members or other people in their environment. One study showed a drastic increase in 179 QAnon Facebook groups membership following lockdown. And following lockdown, it skyrocketed from 213,000 members in March to 1.4 million members in July 2020. That was a study by Argentino. So what's crucial about the spread of protests that we're seeing is, of course, also the spread of disinformation and misinformation across social media about the origins, the causes, the spread, the preventive measures, and the treatment of the virus, as well, of course, as the denial of its existence. And what Wardle and Direction have shown is that content that plays on people's emotions is most successful because it drives resharing among people wanting to connect with their online communities. So the pandemic created an environment, a perfect environment, right, where people were experiencing anger, fear, anxiety in response to the pandemic, as well as increasing isolation. And they were turning to social media as a way to stay connected, but also as a way to stay informed. And this creates, obviously, conditions that are very favorable for the widespread circulation of disinformation. And it creates an opportunity for specific political actors to channel the disinformation and the emotions inspired by it to their preferred agendas. Now, sometimes this is directed at the government, but we also had situations like the United States and Brazil, where it's the president of the country who is actually assisting in spreading this. So this is something that we really haven't seen before. I can't think of another kind of example of when there's a global crisis and the world leaders are saying, yeah, don't worry about it. You know, don't listen to any of my experts in government. It's all good. I mean, Trump, as we know, he advocated harmful and ineffective treatments, including bleach and hydroxychloroquine. He shared conspiracy theories in at least 1,710 of the tweets that he posted on his personal Twitter account. And Bolsonaro took a similar stance in Brazil. So social media plays a key role then in fostering distrust in science and in fostering distrust in expert information. And there was a study by researchers at King's College London and Ipsos Mori that found that social media is being used to amplify harmful and unfounded claims, and that 1 in 3 people in the UK reported having been exposed to COVID-19 anti-vaccination messages, with Facebook being the leading source by far. So, I mean, there's a lot more data on this in the paper that you can look at the details, but the thing that we need to remember is that the widespread, just as with the widespread effects of information disorders in general, the most worrying thing, the most worrying impact of the circulation of disinformation and misinformation isn't that a minority of people believe in it. That's not the problem. That's not the main problem. It's that they begin to doubt the veracity of information in general. That is the real pernicious aspect of disinformation that we need to be aware of. And so in the UK, relatively few people believed conspiracy theories about the direct health impacts of the vaccine, but large numbers said that they weren't sure if they were true or if they were false. And it's this doubt that makes people receptive to other conspiracy theories, which can then be aligned with a particular political agenda, okay? So here, social media plays a crucial role in this process of alignment, because the particular affordances of Facebook and YouTube algorithms direct people to increasingly extreme content, and they also direct traffic in such a way as to gather a diverse group of people in a shared space, creating filter bubbles. And a study by Thomas and Zhang argued that very small groups of conspiracists can potentially influence recommender algorithms to expose new, unsuspecting users to their views. So it doesn't take a lot of people at all to get this process going. And research on QAnon shows that online groups are populated by people who are motivated by a really wide range of religious, spiritual, environmental, and health concerns, who then became politicized in these spaces via a shared concern about COVID-19. So that's what brought them together. So QAnon messages then acted as a topical bridge between far left and far right channels, traversing from far right issues to other causes such as climate activism. And according to Bodner et al., 2020, distrust in science in right-wing popular narratives is actually designed to erode trust in democratic institutions. And it's designed to erode trust in our elected representatives. And following COVID, it's designed also to sow panic, right? They want a panic situation. So the wider implications of this are that distortions of information landscapes as a result of social influence can cause people to ignore or even counteract public health policies and expert advice. And conspiracy theories can actually inflict really serious damage when they enter the realm of politics and public health. We can see that very clearly in the content of these COVID negationist, anti-vaxxer, anti-COVID measure protests. So what does all this tell us about the relationship between social movements and democracy in times of crisis, and in particular in the context of COVID-19? While the positive cases show the crucial role that social movements can play to bolster or correct deficiencies in contemporary democracy in times of crisis, at the other end of the spectrum, the pandemic provided opportunities for the weaponization of disinformation about COVID that was tied to far-right political agendas and anti-democratic narratives. The pandemic was very easily incorporated into political disinformation campaigns that predated it, such as the QAnon, to prey on citizen fears, anxieties, and distrust of government and public institutions. While certain aspects specific to the COVID-19 pandemic really facilitated this issue bridging, right? This conditions of the COVID, we can't overlook that. It's not difficult to see how similar dynamics might develop around other global threats to planetary well-being, such as climate change. And indeed, recent research has drawn links between the ontological insecurity provoked by climate change and COVID-19 and its effect on the rejection of expert knowledge. Now, because scientific inquiry by nature rejects absolutes, right? It's always a process of we think this, we tinkering, we debate, we change, right? It develops through the testing of competing hypotheses. It becomes an easy target for politically motivated disinformation because that preys on people's need for simple explanations, for absolute truths, and someone to blame for their misfortune, right? So human psychology has to enter into our understanding of how people respond to crisis as well. Now, Ulrich Beck alerted us to the effects of the crisis of public belief and trust in scientific knowledge expertise in his work on the Risk Society. And at the time he was writing, he could have no understanding or even foretell the role that social media was going to play in this scenario. Yet the connection between trust in institutions and the effective management of risk are very, very clear in the context of the pandemic. Although trust in government surged early in the pandemic, it eroded significantly as the pandemic dragged on. And because assessment of risk involves not only rational, analytical, logical reasoning, but also experiential assessments based on individuals' emotions, on their interests, on their values, simply providing people with solid, good information is not enough. It's not the solution. It will not correct the problem of faulty risk assessments by members of the public. So we can't keep relying on this rational actor model. We have to understand human behavior in a much more complete way. Instead, what can we do in this scenario? Public trust in public institutions needs to be restored. It is no coincidence that New Zealand's outstanding record in COVID-19 management was accompanied by the high trust that New Zealanders placed in their government, 83% in June of 2020. Trust in government increases the likelihood of compliance with difficult policy changes such as virus containment measures, and it's likely to increase receptivity to expert and scientific messaging. And here in Denmark, I think we witnessed the same phenomenon. And what the Taiwan case shows us is that trust becomes a virtuous circle. The more citizens trust the central epidemic command center, the greater they comply, the better able the government can handle the risk, the lower the deaths and infections, the greater citizen trust, etc. And around we go. So progressive social movements that are committed to democratic innovation and regeneration can really play a key role in this endeavor. But the takeaway for me, and with this I'm finishing, is that although I still argue strongly that social movements are a sine qua non for democracy, we need to also be aware of how they can work to undermine democracy, something that lots of social movement scholars have ignored for many years and now obviously are paying much more attention to. The pandemic provides us with empirical data on how unexpected and damaging these effects can be. So movements can be knowledge producers, and they can bring to light knowledge that governments and other agencies are maybe covering up or not bringing to light. But they can also be producers of disinformation and misinformation with very, very damaging effects for our democracies. Especially, as I said before, to the effect that this has on doubting the veracity of all information, which is the real problem. And I think the last point is that when we look at the people's behavior in these contexts, we need to consider the context. We need to consider the emotional state in which people access and engage with information online. And earlier research of mine shows this in very, very different context, in a non-crisis context, how crucial the emotional state people are in when they access and engage in information, how that plays on their decision-making and their evaluation of the experience that they're having. And so we need to pay attention to that just as those who seek to sow panic and erode democracy are very much paying attention to that when they plan their disinformation campaigns, when they manipulate algorithms to push their particular agendas. So thank you very much for listening, and I will leave it there.